I have a question for everyone here. Who here likes money? Who here wants to have a successful career and live in a strong economy? I think we all do. A strong economy creates opportunities by supporting businesses, creating jobs, and improving people's quality of life. But what helps an economy grow? One factor that has shaped economies around the world is international trade. And trade allows countries to access goods, resources, and technologies that they need. International trade includes many different activities, but today we're going to focus on one important part of trade, imports. So today I ask you all to follow alongside me as we chart a course through data, exploring countries and years to uncover the relationship between trade activity and economic performance. As we go through our journey today, we are going to find the answer to the question, how is import growth associated with economic performance trends and key economic factors across countries and years? To find the answer to this question, we will be using several datasets. For our independent variable, we will use a dataset that looks at the annual percentage growth in imports of goods and services, meaning this dataset shows how the amount countries bought from other countries changed each year over 25 years in a percent format. For our dependent variable, we will use three different datasets. The first dataset looks at the annual gross domestic product, or GDP growth. In basic terms, this data set shows how the percent of how much goods, how much the amount of goods and services a country produces increased or decreased each year. The second data set looks at the annual growth of gross capital formation, or GCF. That means that this data set shows the percentage of how much countries invested in things like buildings, equipment, technology, and other resources. The third data set looks at the annual growth of household consumption. In simple terms, this data set shows the percentage of how much people and households increased or decreased their spending each year. In other words, if these three dependent variables increase, then this means that the economy is most likely growing. This is a dashboard I created where I used all four of the data sets I mentioned earlier. The line chart in the top left shows the average GDP change over several years. The purpose of this graph is to show that economic conditions change over time. The GDP growth is only one indicator of economic performance, but it does not capture every part of an economy. Anyway, the graph on the top right looks at GDP and imports, the bottom left looks at GCF and imports, and the bottom right looks at household consumption and imports. I also made filters that allow us to look at certain countries and years. Now, looking at this data overall from 2000 to 2024, we can see that as imports increased, generally GDP, GCF, and household consumption also increased. And looking at the line chart, we can see that GDP growth fluctuated over the years, showing that economies change over time rather than staying constant. Now let's take a closer look at the data, looking at a country that has very few natural resources, such as Yemen, between 2010 and 2020. Looking at Yemen, we can see that GDP growth fluctuates over time, and as imports increase, GDP, GCF, and household consumption growth generally increases as well. Even in a country with fewer natural resources, this follows the same overall pattern we observed in the broader sense in the previous slide. Now let's compare these results with a country that has a lot of natural resources, keeping the data within the same time period, 2010 to 2020. Let's take a look at Brazil. As you can see here, between 2010 and 2020, even though Brazil has a lot of natural resources, we can still see the same pattern observed in the previous two slides. As imports growth increases, GDP growth, GCF growth, and household consumption growth also generally increases. Looking at the line chart, we can still see that economic growth changes over time rather than remaining constant. Using the previous three slides, we can conclude that growth in imports is positively associated with growth in GDP, GCF, and household consumption across different national contexts, and this pattern appears to be generally consistent throughout the data. Just because a country is importing more goods, it does not necessarily mean that the economy will immediately grow. And importing alone does not guarantee economic growth. Economies take time to respond, and growth happens gradually as businesses invest, consumers spend, and markets adjust. However, the data shows that higher import growth is associated with improvements in important economic indicators. What this suggests is that increasing imports can be an effective strategy for supporting economic growth. While imports alone are not the only factor that influences an economy, the positive relationships we observed with GDP growth, GCF growth, and household consumption growth suggest that policies that support healthy international trade and the movement of goods can help create conditions for a stronger economy. At this point, you may be wondering whether there are other things that have a stronger relationship with economic growth, such as government investment in education. Well, why don't we take a look at that? This data set shows the percentage of total government spending that a country spends on education each year. It includes money spent on schools, students, education services, and managing and improving the country's education system. Now let's compare it with our economic growth indicators and see how the relationship compares to what we observed with import growth. These are some graphs I made using Python, and looking at this slide, we compared the percent of government spending on education each year with our economic growth factors. When looking at the trend lines, we can see that there is not a strong visible relationship between education spending and these economic indicators. Compared to the relationships we observed with import growth, these trend lines are much flatter, suggesting that at least for this very specific data set, education spending shows a weaker relationship with these economic factors. This does not mean that education is not important for an economy, but it suggests that import growth has a stronger connection with these economic indicators we analyzed for this specific data set. In conclusion, higher import growth is generally associated with stronger growth in GDP, GCF, and household consumption across different countries and years. International trade is not just about buying goods from other countries. It allows nations to access resources, technology, and other products that can support businesses, investments, and economic activity. While imports alone do not guarantee economic growth and economies take time to respond, the patterns we observe suggest that trade can be an important tool for creating stronger economic conditions. The question is not whether international trade can influence economies. The question is how can we increase trade to create more economic opportunities. Change begins when we recognize opportunities and make informed decisions. Now, I encourage everyone to take what you have learned here today and think about how supporting international trade can help build a stronger economy.